of the presentations are in English, so those who like to have interpretation, you can get your devices across this hall. My name is Hala Shaibi. I am professor of international law at Birzeit University. Our session is the economic use and international responsibility. We have three different cases of economic use, and the first one by Zena Kilani. Zena, she works on research on applying technology on economic equality and human rights. She has a PhD in law, and she has university degrees in history and political science, and she worked in public administration. The title of her paper is the case study of Sagot Winery wines in Canada and in the Canadian markets. The second one by the name Sharat. Muayyid Sharat. He works in economic sustainable development with the farmers since 2010. And the third paper will be by Maria Farah and Asil Abu Bakr. Maria and Asil couldn't be with us. They are researchers in international law and human rights. Professor Anan Abu Shanab, she's assistant researcher at Human Rights Watch. She has a master's degree in refugee enforced migration from Oxford. She will present their paper. زين الفلوس. Good evening. ورقتي هي حول
in the Canadian markets. I'm just going to do a quick overview of Sugar Winery case and then I'll go into the legal implications. Sugar Winery is a case not just about wine. It's certainly not about IPS has been a part of since sanctions movement, and it never has been. That's clear. Local arguments about business and human rights, or that the legal status of Israel as an occupying power should be examined, or that not addressing settlements and settlement issues of land and resource appropriation or exploitation would fail to cover all aspects of the situation. However, Sagot Winery case is fundamentally a battle of the worlds. It's about free trade agreements and food labeling laws in Canada specifically. The Canadian food labeling laws supersede the allied relationship Canada and Israel have. Also, Israel free trade agreements supersede Canadian domestic law. At first glance, one is tempted to compare Sagot Winery, the case in Canada, to other Israeli companies such as SodaStream or Ahava, because all three businesses functioned in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Area C. SodaStream, according to Al-Haq, has since moved outside the OPT after intense pressure and scrutiny from BDS. And the Chinese company that bought Ahava is also planning to move their company out of the settlement where it currently functions. Sagot Winery will not be locating anytime soon. However, the comparison with these two other companies would broaden the scope and obfuscate something very basic: Canadian food labeling laws and the free trade agreement Canada has with Israel. I argue that this is a domestic Canadian law case at its core. One only has to look at examples of France when it comes to wine and cheese, labeling how militant it can get. No longer were Australians, when they had a free trade agreement with Europe and France, allowed to call sherry, champagne, Roquefort by these widely known names because they were not produced in those specific areas in the EU. France and the European Union food labeling laws set the tone for how Australians were allowed to label their products and sell them in Australia. It had to become port, sparkling wine, and blue cheese. The labeling was paramount, otherwise France, through the European Union and negotiating, would not agree to the free trade agreement. Australia capitulated because the free trade agreement would create a major trading partner for Australia's benefit. So in my paper, I write about the history of the West Bank settlement of Sagot, but most people here already know about it.
I'm just going to give you a quick overview of why Sagot is important to this paper. The international community considers all Israeli settlements and outposts in the West Bank illegal under international law, but the Israeli government has often disputed this characterization. The West Bank settlements contain almost 30 vineyards, some of which created worldwide award-winning wines. Sagot Winery is one of the largest producing vineyards. They produce 200,000 bottles per year, covering 62 acres in their settlement. The Israeli human rights group Yeshdin claims that Sagot settlement partly lies on privately owned Palestinian land, which of course the Israelis dispute. Indeed, it is known that at least 27 settlements, Sagot included, extend onto private Palestinian land. That's not disputable. Yaakov Berg is the founder of Sagot Winery. He founded it in 1998. Previous to producing wines, he was a lawyer. He claims he didn't move to the West Bank because of any ideological commitment. However, he claims the continual pressure from civil society organizations that oppose settlements as illegal have served only to harden his position. We all know that Israel passed legislation in 2011 that made it illegal for Israeli citizens to boycott businesses that operate in settlements in the West Bank. Berg had considered previously taking legal action, because he was a lawyer, against those who fought against the new law to protect his business. Sagot's sales after that law have increased year by year, but not because of the 2011 law that Israel had passed, but because Sagot relies heavily on exporting their wines. Sagot exports largely to the United States, but also to other places such as Canada and countries in Asia. The winery has also won accolades in Panama, England, the United States. In 2018, the World Finance magazine published its Fine Wine Report and granted Sagot Winery a Fine Wine Award, dismissing the fact that it's a settlement wine. And Al-Haq human rights organization in the West Bank wrote a letter identifying this grape washing, so-called grape washing. So that's the background. The case in context with Canada. So although Sagot Winery's business has been increasing every year, they've suffered a series of setbacks. Because the European Union rulings, it was determined in late 2012 that goods produced by Israeli companies in occupied territories cannot be regarded as having the labels originated in Israel, product of Israel, or made in Israel. In mid-2013, wine exported to European markets would have to be labeled produce of the West Bank, brackets, Israeli settlement produce, or Israeli produce of the OPT, occupied Palestinian territories. In late 2015, the EU member states correctly implemented these standards. This is different than Canada. The EU labeling standard falls in line with Canadian food labeling standards, but the result from these food labeling standards has been different in Canada. The saga of Sagot Winery case in Canada begins in January of 2015. Dr. David Kattenberg, a Canadian resident, son of Holocaust survivors, was surprised to find wines on a liquor store shelf mislabeled, product of Israel. One of the wines was Sagot wine. He filed a complaint with the Liquor Board of Ontario. Dr. David Kattenberg's complaint to the LCBO, the Liquor Board of Ontario, was in regards to selling those two wines, one of which was Sagot, incorrectly labeled product of Israel. In March 2017, so 3 months later, the LCBO, the Ontario Liquor Board, failed to address Dr. Kattenberg's complaint. So he filed another complaint to a higher authority. It was the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. This Canadian Food Inspection Agency is responsible for all food labeling products, food and drink labeling products in Canada. It protects Canadian consumers for foods that are imported into Canada. They're mandated by law to ensure the safety of food and beverages sold in Canada, and that they're accurately labeled with their country of origin or the origin of the product. What Dr. David Kattenberg didn't know was that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency immediately came under attack and intense lobbying from the Israeli government and its advocates in Canada. The B'nai B'rith and the Center for the Israeli and Jewish Affairs, a Canadian member of parliament named Michael Levitt, who's also the chair of the Canada-Israel Parliamentary Group, all got involved as soon as the Canadian Food Inspection Agency's decision was sent to the Ontario board. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency saw the complaint. They said, yeah, this isn't a product of Israel, sent an email to the Liquor Board of Ontario that these wines are incorrectly labeled and need to be removed from the shelves. As soon as that happened, all these Israeli advocates started lobbying the Canadian government. The B'nai B'rith claims to be an advocacy group that that describes itself as a staunch defender of the state of Israel. When they became aware of the complaint, they professed shock, dismay that the Canadian Consumer Agency would require wines produced in settlements to be labeled accurately. So, according to the Israeli lobby in Canada, settlement wines are a product of Israel because settlements are Israeli. They're Israeli property, Israeli territory, Israeli products. So Dr. David Kattenberg was waiting for some kind of acknowledgement of his complaint from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. He was surprised to learn from Facebook on a post from the B'nai B'rith that they had successfully lobbied the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, to get the decision to remove the wines off Canadian shelves reversed. So Justin Trudeau had a private meeting with the B'nai B'rith, and they convinced him that Sagot wines are a product of Israel, and he reversed the decision of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So this led to outrage in Canada, because, like I said before, French wines not produced in certain areas have to be labeled differently than French wines that are wines not produced in certain areas in France have to be labeled differently than wines produced in certain areas. So this created double standard and superseded domestic Canadian law. The decision appeared in the National Post, in the newspaper in Canada, and the Times of Israel started reporting on it. What they tried to say was that Dr. David Kattenberg was advocating for BDS, but it was quite the opposite. Dr. David Kattenberg wanted Canadian law implemented across the board without exceptions. And Sagot Winery and Mr. Berg, with the Israeli lobby's backing, wanted an exception for Israeli wines, or for settlement wines, sorry. The reason that the Prime Minister was able to supersede Canadian domestic law was for something very peculiar. So we're not going to argue whether West Bank settlements are legal or illegal or disputed or whatever Israel says, because in the Canadian-Israeli Free Trade Agreement, there's a provision that authorizes products. I'm just going to read it to you here. They've created vagueness on purpose. So the Canadian-Israeli Free Trade Agreement was worded in a way to create vagueness. It defined the purposes of the agreement, the territory for settlements of the State of Israel, as territory in which Israeli custom laws apply. While we know that Israel is militarily occupying the West Bank, they can do and apply any laws they want and see fit in the West Bank. Custom laws cover long-standing legal patterns of behavior that authorities consider to be custom and accepted as law. In the Palestinian territories, there are multiple sets of laws and legal patterns. The custom laws of Israel in the settlements, the Israeli military law for Palestinians, and the laws of the Palestinian Authority, which Israel can supersede or override at any time. Custom law in the West Bank ought to be under Palestinian patterns of behavior and Palestinian legal authorities. Yet under military occupation, military law applies with the exception of the settlements, which Israel treats as Israeli territory. So basically, it's a spider web. They've created multiple legal systems, and they've created the vagueness in the Canadian-Israeli Free Trade Agreement to be able to override Canadian domestic law and food labeling laws. So Israeli settlement products don't need to evade oversight or inspection because of the definition that they've accepted with the Canadian government that normalizes settlement products and does away with the need to hide the origin because the Canadian government has accepted an altered definition. These factors make the Canadian-Israeli free trade agreement interpretation of what constitutes territory highly non-standard. It would never be accepted for an example, a product, in this case, you would apply Russian custom law in Ukraine to Crimea. So Russia is occupying Crimea. Any product produced in Crimea would still be labeled product of Ukraine in Canada, wouldn't be accepted or imported with the product of Russia label on it. So the conclusions, what I'm going to end on, is that Sagot Winery and their wines are back on Canadian liquor store shelves. While this case is before the court, it's gone all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court. Israel keeps banging their fists on desks saying this is about BDS. And I'm saying this is about something much more simple than BDS. BDS is on an international scale. This is about altering domestic law for the free trade. Israel is not a large free trade partner with Canada, and Canada shouldn't be altering their legal definition of terms for Israel. It's not like they're making an exceptional amount of money based on the Israeli free trade. Second, accepting this definition of territory based on custom law of an occupying power essentially legalizes and legitimizes the settlements through a free trade agreement, bypassing the usual foreign affairs standard that's applied. This could cause, as a legal precedent in cases outside the scope of wine, this could cause a hassle outside the scope of wine and wine labeling. This style of definition could be used in other free trade agreements with countries whose interests in Canada could compromise Canadian sovereignty through trade. So if we think about the United States with Donald Trump right now, the United States is a large trading partner with Canada. His politics aren't very friendly at the moment. So this could put Canadian consumers and Canadian domestic law at risk. If the courts see this case presented here, Sagot wine and wineries will be pulled from the shelves until it's labeled differently and may not even allow the wines from the settlements back into Canada. If the courts do not see this case of one of protecting Canadian domestic laws over free trade with allied states, Sagot wineries will stay on the shelf in Canada and laws will be weakened in the eyes of the citizen who look to their governments for protection. Thank you.
شكرا زينب. رح نكون هلأ مع مؤيد بشارات وفي ورقة باسم دور المنظمات الدولية في صناعة التغيير في الحياة اليومية.
هل الدراسة الورقة المقدمة هي جزء من مشروع الدفاع عن حقوق المواطنين في غور الأردن الذين يواجهون سياسات الاستعمار والخصخصة والنيوليبرالية؟
And new liberal policies. The study was one of the three paradigms that were made in collaboration with Al-Marsad. The paper we are presenting today is the role of international organizations in changing or making changes in daily life of inhabitants of the Jordan Valley post-Oslo. The presentation today comprises 9 parameters. We will speak of the international position on which international organizations must apply in implementing activities in Area C and especially in the Jordan Valley. The EU-funded projects which were demolished and the position of donor agencies regarding the Israeli occupation measures, economic interventions, agro-industrial estate in Gaza, and the thirst policies and the Dead Red Canal. That was the topic of the previous session. The energy projects under occupation, solar energy, and Palestinian economic investment, and compliance of North or Jordan Valley citizens to payment of utility, electricity, and water bills. I will give you first a summary of the international aid to Palestinian territory since the Oslo Accord. According to OECD, over $35 billion were spent in the West Bank and Gaza Strip between 1993 to 2016, including about 70% in the form of assistance since 2006 to 2016, that is in the past 10 years. This means that every Palestinian citizen received an average assistance of $560 a year per capita. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Finances, 2016 to 2016, it received grants of about $4 billion, including 40% from Arab donors, mainly Saudi Arabia, and 60% from foreign donors, mainly the EU, World Bank, and USA. The European aid was channeled either through the EU or through EU members, individual countries, whether directly or through the EU. The Palestinian territory received about 6 billion euros between 2000 to 2015. That is over a span of 15 years. 45% came as direct assistance to the PNA budget and 31% to UNRWA and 10% to humanitarian aid. Under the international assistance regime, there is always a threat either to the PNA or to the Palestinian society by, as they say, blocking the flow of aid. And these countries include Norway, which has been providing about $77 million to the Palestinian Authority between 2011 to 2016. 50% go directly to the PNA budget, 21% to the good governance. And this aid is conditioned that 63% of it be under the management of international parties like the World Bank, and 22% in the form of Norwegian non-governmental organizations. We have also Denmark, which is also threatening to block its aid to the Palestinian Authority. It provided $25 million to the PNA in the period between 2012 to 2016, and its yearly funding is decreasing every year. And this funding is channeled either through the EU or the EC or the World Bank. And it is through international consultancy companies that implement the Danish activities in the Palestinian territory. The agency or donor agencies that support most the PNA budget is USA, either directly to the PNA treasurer by supporting the security sector or through USAID projects in infrastructure projects. The PNA expected to receive $2 billion between 2012 and 2016, but the United States only provided $1.8 billion, to where $30 million be allocated per year. 300. The international organizations operating in the Palestinian territory, whether as international agencies or as donors, they are protected by the provisions of the international law in implementing their activities in the Jordan Valley without the need to apply what the occupation authorities deem fit for the implementation of these projects. For example, international humanitarian law considers the creation of settlement blocks in the Palestinian territory as violating the international law and resolutions. The Hague Agreement and Israel exploitation of the Jordan Valley natural resources contradicts with international law provisions, especially the Hague Agreement. So the region has been controlled through military occupation is not an open territory for economic or any other form of exploitation, according to the international law. Regarding the international human rights law, Israel, by establishing settlements in Area C and in the Jordan Valley, is violating the rights of the Palestinians because the settlements deprive the Palestinians from the right to self-determination, imposes restriction on their mobility and access to education because schools are segregated from residential areas through this segregation policy. An EU report published by in 2017, 123 establishments were either wholly or partially demolished, resulting in the displacement of 600 Palestinians, including 350 children. 80 of these establishments received direct assistance from the EU. EU countries issued a statement in this regard, either referring to international law instruments to solve it or to ask the civil administration to pay compensation for the damage it caused in these areas. The key problem in implementing the activities, whether it be by the EU or any other international organization, is that they need a previous permission from the occupation authorities. So all of the interventions implemented through these organizations in Area C depend on the decision of the occupation and its civil administration. The economic interventions, most of the economic interventions in Area C or in the Jordan Valley are based on studies and recommendations of the World Bank, most of which purposefully or non-purposefully neutralize the main reason behind the problem, which is the occupation and Israeli control of the land, and they're causing the suffering of inhabitants of this land. These recommendations include that if the Palestinians are able to access about 50,000 dunams in the Jordan Valley, they can support their GNP by over $1 billion a year, or that is 3.5% for the Jordan Valley area. The projects already implemented through the policies applied by international organizations is the agro-industrial estate in Jericho, which was funded by JICA, the Japanese International Assistance Agency, in 2005. And the main objective behind the project is to establish a Jordanian-Palestinian economic project, but the project developed to include the state of the occupation as a fourth partner, and it was even called the Corridor to Peace and Prosperity. In our study, we conducted interviews with farmers in this regard, farmers in the Mid and North Jordan Valley. Part of them have never heard of this estate, and some could not imagine that this estate will serve their needs because it is remote compared to the localities of production of vegetables and other agricultural produce. Some farmers describe them as joint projects that serve mainly the occupation. Regarding the water crisis in Area C and Jordan Valley, based on the interventions in this conference, the Jordan area is described as an area of scarce water resources, and this is an erroneous information. The Jordan area is located to the north aquifer, and it's one of the richest aquifers in Palestine, in historical Palestine. But what is being marketed by international organization is that Jordan Valley endures the scarcity of water resources, and therefore we need to seek alternatives to these resources rather than solving the political issue with the occupation authorities. And then they start asking the occupation to provide the Palestinians with the water they need. So most of the interventions adopted by international organizations in the water sector correspond and are consistent with the decisions and policies of the occupation authorities and civil administration. For example, one of the most important needs in terms of water in the Jordan Valley is to rehabilitate the aquifer irrigation wells and this requires permissions from the Israeli occupation authorities, and therefore most international organizations do not intervene, or they intervene at a very limited scale to rehabilitate these wells. Dr. Stefan explained before the question of the Bahrain Canal that links the Dead to the Red Sea and provided details about this canal, but we will speak of this issue in detail. And it was an intervention by our colleague. The canal, the general objective is to solve the problem of drought and lower water level in the Dead Sea, and the problem is the overdraft of the water from the water that is supposed to flow in the Dead Sea. A number of researchers sent letters to the World Bank explaining that this project will not serve the Dead Sea alone, but it has other objectives, which may be to develop further settlements alongside the transportation line and to provide water to cool down the Dimona nuclear reactor, and therefore they put the PNA as a shell partner, and the Palestinians will not benefit directly from the project. So if they need any quantities of water, they are supposed to purchase it from Palestinian money and not as a grant resulting from the implementation of the project. Under occupation, the sun does not provide the same rays. This is a solar panel of Shivolot Mohola settlement in northern Jordan Valley. This is one of the commercial solar panels that was established by the occupation authorities in the Jenin and Jordan Valley area, 3 in the Jordan Valley and 1 in the Hebron Hills. Most of these links are connected to the Israeli electric grid, and it is an investment project, but at the same time Palestinians in Area C are not allowed to implement similar projects. Even individual projects funded by international or local organizations are confiscated or demolished by the occupation authorities. Palestinian investment in solar energy, and as part of the recommendations of the World Bank, we have a problem for next year's up to 2030 relating to the electricity demand. There is high demand on electricity in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So the Palestinian private sector were provided with funds to implement certain activities. In photovoltaic cells, we have 4 solar plants, 3 in Tubas, Jericho, and Jenin. Their production output will be 21.5 megawatt. Tubas solar plant will serve the agricultural sector and irrigation. The Jericho is for the trade and general sector, and Jenin for use of the agricultural sector. However, these facts are good when you hear about them, but regular citizens in the area classified C, how are they going to benefit from these projects? The huge profits generated by this project will be paid to private companies, the Palestine Investment Fund, or the water utilities. Will they develop the Jordan Valley and protect farmers in these areas? In the last slide of the presentation, we have policies launched worldwide, and we adopt them, whether it be by the government or other organizations, without any assessment of the social cost on the poor, including prepaid metering of water and electricity. Citizens in the Jordan Valley area suffer from high temperature in the summer, and the problem of water is not a key problem even if there are prepaid meters. But in the question of electricity, I don't think that anybody who promotes the prepaid meters for the Jordan Valley area can live for a single day without electricity. In The summer, you need to operate your AC for 24 hours to be able to survive the temperature. But with the crisis in the PNA budget, and as part of the attempts to reform, to have economic reform to reduce the electricity bill, there is promotion that probably citizens of the Jordan Valley can start paying their bill. The problem is that these prepaid meters are produced in advanced countries and they are sold to the third world countries. By the end of my presentation, adopting policies of the World Bank that are consistent with the occupation policy represent a burden to any project that aims to confront the occupation and to have a kind of emancipatory development in any area, including the Jordan Valley. And when citizens view citizens as customers with a bill to pay and not as citizens with rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayad. And now with the third presentation by Anan Abu Shanab, titled Adding Salt to the Wounds, Israeli Abuse of Dead Sea. Basically, it's for Asia al-Bahar, and Anan will present it. Thank you. I speak in English, so if you need the translation.
This video addresses first the history of Palestinian exclusion from economic development in the Palestine, and then the inextricable links between Israeli settlement enterprise and Israeli extractive advertising industries, and then the addressing the responsibility of international businesses to respect human rights in populations and their dealings with Israeli settlements. So a bit of the history and the legal concessions of the Dead Sea. This is really interesting. It just shows how Palestinians were excluded from the beginning by various authorities. The Dead Sea is rich in minerals, including potash, uranium, magnesium, and salt. And so the economic potential of extraction was on the radar of only the British mandate, the Zionist movement, and the Palestinians, even though there were claims to apartheid. A Palestinian from West Bank, where the Yahya has been, has started under concession as early as 1913. He expressed this to Ottomans, but he was not awarded the concession, but was promised a original position with the Ottoman Chancellor, with an alleged promise that he would agree to allow concession after the war. Has demonstrated interest in the concession according to the Brits during the mandate, but the Brits have plans to restore the given its economic potential and specifically the cash, so we can do away with their reliance on Germany. Promise of Jewish national homeland was already a reality at this point. And before Henry created the Brits, we support Zionist movement in establishing economic dominance in Palestine. The Zionists were also exploring the potential of the Red Sea as early as 1904, and in 1911, a Russian Jew, Moses Zelensky, traveled here for that specific purpose. At the time when Israel was requesting the concession from the mandate government, Zelensky's plans for the concession were already underway, with support from the Zionist Department of Trade and Industry, as well as the British Colonial Office. Despite his efforts, concession was granted eventually to Novansky in 1930. Novansky established the Palestinian Potash Limited, the PPL, headquarters in what is now the Israeli settlement of Kalia. During the 1948 war, the headquarters of PPL was destroyed, but the factory on the southern shores remained, now known as Dead Sea Works. The pattern of Palestinian exclusion from Dead Sea economy was aggravated with the start of the Israeli occupation. It went from mere exclusion to Israel's comprehensive control over Palestinian resources for the benefit of Israelis and settler economy. By the time Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, the economic interests in the Dead Sea area were clear. and it quickly sought to seize vast portions of land. State lands declarations eventually became the main mechanism to acquire large swaths of land in the area, including land that had been exposed due to the shrinking of the lake. Israel began to build settlements. Within 10 years, there were 19 settlements in the Jordan Valley and Dead Sea. Today, there are 37 settlements and outposts. Outposts are even illegal under Israeli law. And Israel continues, of course, to expand them. This year, in 2018, Israel allocated 417 million shekels to that area in particular. These settlements are primarily involved in the extraction of raw materials, agriculture and tourism, exploiting Palestinian natural resources, and providing a boon to the Israeli economy. On the other hand, the Palestinians' use and access to resources is severely limited by Israeli restrictions, including Area C, the drug blocks, the settlement-only roads, etc. A 2013 World Bank report provided that the Palestinian economy could make $918 million from potash, bromine, and magnesium. For example, the only Palestinian factory that operates on shores of the Dead Sea is the West Bank Sea Salts Limited, which faces an array of difficulties due to Israeli restrictions. The factory was established in 1964, and after 1967, Israel declared the area where it is located as a closed military zone. Employees needed a permit to enter the factory, since it was in Area C. It also means that the factory cannot expand or rehabilitate itself. And the salt evaporation bonds are locked behind metal fences and manned by Israeli soldiers who control when and if they can collect the salt. The restrictions hamper business development. On the other hand, settlement businesses flourish. For example, Mitzpe Shalem, a settlement established in 1970 on the land of Antiba, is home to Ahava, which is known to exploiting Palestinian resources and extracting mud. It is the only company that had a license to extract mud since 2004, but it was recently sold to a Chinese holding company, and Israeli civil authorities claim that Ahava no longer has that license. Nevertheless, their operations continue in the occupied Palestinian territory, including production sites and visitor centers in Mitzpe Shalem. No Palestinian company has a license to extract mud. So what is the Israeli Dead Sea tourism industry? What does it entail? The potential for a thriving Palestinian tourism industry in the Dead Sea is substantial, given all natural and historic sites in the area. Yet, due to Israeli restrictions throughout the OPT, tourism mainly contributes to Palestinian economy. Israel used its control over the OPT to establish a lucrative tourism sector, which consolidates Israel's narrative of the land, including in the Dead Sea area. The World Bank says that Israel has been generating revenues from the Dead Sea area since 1976. Nearly half of the 3.9 million tourists that visited Israel in 2017 went to the Dead Sea. The regularly visited sites included Qumran, the Dead Sea beaches, and Ahava factory store. Each of these three sites functions as a result of a host of international law violations perpetrated by Israel. For example, Qumran is billed as part of the Jewish-Israeli narrative of the land, despite uncertainty surrounding who the original inhabitants of the area were. In 2010, Israel launched a 5-year, $190 million national heritage project, which included Qumran and other Israeli-controlled sites inside the West Bank. The aim was to emphasize the Jewish and national history of Israel. Investment continues. Israel's control over Qumran allowed it to exacerbate and remove Palestinian cultural property in violation of its duties as the occupying power. Some of these artifacts are even shown in the Israel Museum. The Palestinian economy is therefore not only obstructed from the potential earnings from entry fees to Qumran, but what could be gained from displaying the artifacts in a Palestinian museum. This is a significant sum. In 2011, the estimated revenues from Qumran entry alone were $2.05 million US dollars. Israel also benefits from the Dead Sea beaches. For example, Palestinians have to pay entry onto their own coast at Kala Beach, where they are even charged more than Israelis. There are discounts given to Israelis who served in the army, which means like almost everybody who enters the beach will get a discount. And there were also documented incidents of Palestinians being denied entry through the establishment of Beit Ha'arava checkpoint in 2007. Where an Israeli brigade commander was reported to have stated, and I quote, "The arrival of Palestinians from the territories to the beaches harms tourism and the economy of beach owners. The district council," that is of the Israeli settlement, "contacted the defense ministry on this issue, and that is why there is a checkpoint at the Beit Ha'arava junction." A case was brought by ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, against the checkpoint, but it was dismissed. The checkpoint, however, has since been dismantled. So by visiting Dead Sea beaches in the OPT, tourists are providing financial support to the maintenance of unlawful discriminatory business sector. Kala Beach alone estimates 600,000 annual tourists, providing a maximum of $9.8 million US dollars in profit per year. In 2013, the World Bank estimated that if Israeli restrictions were lifted in the Dead Sea area, Palestinian investors would be able to create a Dead Sea hotel industry equivalent to Israel's, producing value added of some 126 million US dollars per annum. These settlement sites also work jointly to support and benefit Israel's tourism industry, as they are bundled together for tour groups. Online tourism companies facilitated and advertised these tours and properties in Israeli settlements. For example, Viator and Expedia market tours to the Dead Sea and Qumran area and include a stop to Ahava. The sites are also independently marketed, like on Booking.com, Travelocity, Expedia, and TripAdvisor all advertise Kala Kibbutz Hotel and other settlement properties. While Booking.com refers to the location as an Israeli settlement, Travelocity, Expedia, and TripAdvisor cite the location as Palestinian territories or simply Kalia. Regardless of the way it is designated, this does not alter the company's responsibility pursuant to international law. Other business enterprises also provide support to Israeli settlement sites, like stores in the US that sell Ahava products. This serves as an outlet for profits and continued brand exposure and legitimization. So what are the business obligations under international law? Businesses connected to Israel's settlement tourism sector are not only obscuring the reality of Israel's occupation, but are also violating their own responsibilities under international law. Business enterprises operating in or with settlements and or in coordination with Israeli occupying authorities in the OPT must respect international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law. The business enterprise's responsibility to protect human rights requires that these businesses to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. In conducting their due diligence, businesses should recognize the international consensus
on the illegality of Israeli settlements in the OPT, as well as Israeli policies in the OPT that violate the right of Palestinians to permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. International crimes, including the transfer of Israeli settlers, the extensive destruction and appropriation of property, and pillage, have all been alleged to occur in the OPT, including in connection with businesses operating in settlements. These crimes, alongside other Israeli policies and practices in the OPT, have a broad impact on the individual and communal rights of Palestinians. This includes the obstruction of the right to self-determination, the right of peoples to freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources, the right to freedom of movement, the right to development, and the right to an adequate standard of living, among others. The United Nations is currently creating a database of all businesses that have directly or indirectly enabled, facilitated, and profited from the construction and growth of settlements. While businesses with a direct presence in settlements such as Ahava have an immediate connection to violations of international law, tourism companies and others based outside of the OPT and Israel also may contribute to adverse human rights impacts due to their business relationships. For example, the aforementioned travel sites such as Booking.com provide a service for marketing and reserving settlement properties. This provides legitimacy and profits for such businesses operating unlawfully. Accurately distinguishing these properties as being an Israeli settlement does not diminish their unlawful presence or the legal responsibilities of the companies such as Booking.com. Also, tourism companies catering to foreign tourists also have an obligation to adhere to the domestic laws in the countries in which they are operating when in conformity with international law. Because states at large do not recognize Israel's sovereignty over the OPT, settlement locations cannot be labeled as Israel. This was highlighted in 2011 when the British Advertising Standards Authority affirmed that the Israeli Ministry of Tourism misled consumers by placing a picture of Qumran under the heading of Israel. And I'll end with these two remarks. Because Israeli settlements activities inherently contribute to serious abuses, these businesses or businesses in dealings with these settlements cannot mitigate abuses regardless of the type of dealing they have with these settlements. And so in order for these businesses to comply with their human rights responsibilities, such as the tourism companies or the travel sites that advertise these sites, like other businesses working with Israeli settlements, should cease doing businesses in or with Israeli settlements. That's the only way they can mitigate the adverse human rights abuses. And I should also suggest that Palestine, the state of Palestine, whether the PA or the PLO, whoever has that authority, should take more active and organized efforts to counter the narrative that Israel pushes forth. And also challenge international businesses and actors that cooperate with Israeli settlements. Thank you.
بدي أشكر جميع المتحدثين إنهم التزموا في الوقت. رح يكون حالياً عنا ثلث ساعة نقاش فتح باب للأسئلة. إذا حدا عنده أي سؤال رجاءً بس يرفع إيده. رح ناخد مبدئياً 3 ل 4 أسئلة. تفضل. في مايك ولا ما في؟
يعطيكم العافية. بعرفش إذا هو أكتر سؤال أو ملاحظة أو تعليق على مداخلة مؤيد. بفكر في إشكالية بنيوية بالورقة أو بالمداخلة اللي هي بتتعلق بأنه الورقة فيها يعني فيها فرضية كامنة أو فيها توقع أنه هاي المنظمات الدولية هي أصلاً أداة تحررية، فلما ما تسويش هاي الوظيفة إحنا يعني زي كأنه بتخذلنا أو يعني بنتفاجأ. فيعني يعني أنا بفكر إنه كل التوجه أو التعامل مع هاي المنظمات الدولية هو لازم يكون على إنه هي أصلا مش أداة تحررية، ولا بحياتها رح تكون أداة تحررية. ممكن يعني في أحسن الأحوال إذا بدنا نكون كرمة ممكن نتعامل معها على إنها يعني بتحسن
improving to some humanitarian situation. But you cannot consider them or expect this of them and then to be surprised that they didn't do that. In their core, they are, be it the EU or USAID or Denmark or Europeans. I don't want to say they complement the colonialism project, and they can be one of its tools. And you spoke about the profits to the Palestinian private sector Palestinian companies, such as electricity and others. There is another point. I don't know how valid it is, but it is connected to anything that has to do with projects with international organizations, which is the profits gained by the international organizations, especially JICA and the EU, Denmark and Norway. Very few wrote about them, such as Sami Hannafi, Linda Tabar, and others. It's almost impossible that any of these organizations would provide support to any project unless they are certain to get back revenues for them. If the Japanese are offering you a project, then the machines, the tractors, or whatever will be from Japan, and experts will come to serve as experts. I don't know if you face this question, but they make profit. Thank you. Question to Zina. If you can provide us with some information about Sagot, such as the number of population there, how much revenue they generate out of selling 200,000 bottles. Is this the main income for the settlement, or do they have other industries? There is another thing, I don't know if you know, the land itself upon which the settlement was established. This land belongs or has special status because it was bought by Kuwaiti real estate company. It was bought by a real estate company. If we can invest this, so if Kuwait itself can be engaged as in facing Israel. Thank you. Since 1948 until Oslo, there were Arab international boycott to Israel. And the companies that work boycott Israeli companies and companies that deal with make business with Israel. After Oslo, Arab boycott ended. Now the BDS, we support them, but boycotting the products of Israeli settlements only, this is a recognition that Israel as an entity is legitimate. Don't you think the production of the Israeli products produced in Haifa, Yafa, and others, do you think they are legitimate? Boycott should include all Israel. So everything is boycotted. When we say boycotting the products of the settlements, it's as if you are acknowledging that Israel has a right to 80% of Palestine. And that's it. Thank you. I have an important point about the session. Here we are discussing what the Israelis did, be it in Sukkot or in the Dead Sea, and what the international organizations did in the valleys. But we, the Palestinians, what did we do? There should have been a paper that sheds light, if any, if there are efforts or budgets allocated to Sukkot issue, for instance, or Dead Sea. There are no Palestinian legal official departments that followed this issue at the international level, international organizations, relevant organizations, and so forth. These are just examples. All the settlements in the Jordan Valley, I'm sure there are some of them that were established on privately owned land or confiscated. And the issue of export, many countries that import from them, and things are naturally moving. So the self factor here is absented in this session, the Palestinian factor, in the issue of economic development. And the opposite Palestinian campaign, counter campaign to what the Israeli settlers do in annexing the valleys, it's absented, and I believe. Thank you. Just to continue with my comment, I really hope that Mr. Muayyad would have shed more light on what is done by the Palestinian NGOs in the Jordan Valley area. What are their efforts before we criticize the internationals? What have we done? Thank you. 2 points. The first one was, this is a technical question somehow. I don't know the Canadian legal framework. What is it? Is there a possibility to take the issue a level from local boycott to the Canada national level? And to turn it into a public opinion issue? Because you said it's not a BDS issue only. أنت مستر بشارات. You spoke about billions of dollars since 1993. Not all of them that went to the 30, not as direct budgets, but some of them went to the CSOs, and we know their policies of these organizations. Now, did they participate, these CSOs? Have they participated? Now we are speaking about the political money that was paid after Oslo, or the political price. Were they involved, or did they have their different programs? Thank you. Zainab? Can I answer English? مستوطنة ساغوت هي فقط 1850 شخص يسكنون فيها. 1850 شخص.
that's the main source of income for the people living on the settlement.
قديش الدخل؟
I don't have the right numbers how much they make, and you would have ways to find it. I'll take them let you know. About recording it actually doesn't matter as a Muslim so it doesn't matter because I'll just read a little section of my paper to you. It may be true that Sherman purchased land. He purchased the land from the Israeli government. But how did the Israeli government sell the land on the West Bank to begin with? How did they get out with the private of the land? Well, the Palestinian registered their land in the West Bank with the Israeli authorities before 1967. They weren't. They didn't need to because effective control of the area was by Jordan at the time. And why would any Palestinian register their land after 1967 with the occupying military government? They wouldn't either. So the only reason, so the occupation was supposed to be temporary, and the only reason that they've continued with this settlement and saying that it's owned by Berg is because there hasn't been one person who's been able to produce one physical document showing that they own the land. There's no actual piece of paper for anybody, Tawil or anybody else that says we own this land. That's why the Israeli government said we can sell it and bought it from Kuwaitis or I don't know who. That was the reasoning. That doesn't mean that that's legal or sound. About BDS, the reason I'm saying that this isn't a BDS issue is because before BDS لازم يطبقوا القانون الكندي. القانون الكندي بيقول إنه ما لازم يفوتوا أي غرض مكتوب عليه صنع في إسرائيل وهو ما صنع في إسرائيل. So قبل ما نحكي بالبي دي اس في قانون بكندا ما عم يتطبق. يعني نحن مش بقلب كندا ما عم نحترم القانون الكندي. هذا الشيء يعني it's very shocking. In Canada, the Canadian government is accepting to break its own laws because they have an ally with Israel. And Israel is not a major trading partner like the United States or China or the EU. So to break their own domestic laws makes the citizens in Canada worry about the government's intentions. And the problem with this case is that because the Canadian government is not respecting their own laws, it went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. There is a Supreme Court challenge to make sure that this doesn't happen with any settlement products. I'm not saying that Israeli products are okay or we don't need to do BDS or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that this case will set a precedent. If the Supreme Court in Canada finds that Canadian law supersedes the Canadian Israeli Free Trade Agreement, then the settlement products can't be labeled. And then Canadian law will be final. But if they don't, then products that are produced in China or the South China Islands or Vietnam or whatever can be labeled anything and sold in Canada. So it's using Canadian law to ensure that not only the Israelis don't break what's standard, but also the rest of the world respects laws. So like Ahava, they sell Ahava in Canada and it says product of Israel on it. If Sagot Wines were forced to say that it's a settlement, then Ahava will also have to say that it's a settlement product. And nobody wants to buy a settlement product. People will shy away from that. So this is the test case.
As for the first question, the paper was not as if we were surprised by the international organizations. But the objective is that to show that the role of the international organizations is to keep the Palestinian economy as dependent on the occupation. But you are speaking about a figure more than $35 billion since 1993 without any tangible change or effect. And this, as a result, should be discussed and examined. Also, as for the profits, now there are Palestinian investments in the valleys, and this is part of the problem now, that the valleys area is not only facing colonialist policies, but we have the privatization policies and the new policies. And we have the companies that turn the farmers into laborers. This is an issue. And some companies, they go to the valleys area deliberately because they don't pay electricity there, and so part of the money there, especially people there have high experience in agriculture. As for the international organizations that implement the projects, I don't think directly, such as if JICA implement the project, they are gaining a profit to Japan. But as you just mentioned, part of the experts will be from the donor country, be it from Japan or Italy or whatever. The equipment, part of it will be bought from a certain country. But the main objective is to show that we have joint projects between the Israeli occupation, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority, so that they can produce or establish the economic peace. And the role of CSOs and Palestinian NGOs, why it was not mentioned. This conference included several papers, and every organization was asked to speak on a certain one. In Jordan Valley, there for more than 10 to 15 years, there are Palestinian organizations that have long history, such as Agricultural Relief, Arij, and others. But their interventions are simple compared to the general needs. Especially, we suffer the scarcity of funding. This is an area C, and donors are reluctant, and so forth. The other thing is that the law, it's a legal issue there, especially as related to the Bedouin communities. Most of the land there is a government one, so in legal follow-up for demolition to be very difficult to work there. So the role of these organizations will be not only implementing projects, but also try to pressure the government or to lobby government policies to make a change there. Hopefully I answered your questions. I have a short intervention to add. Exactly. Tourism had a great impact, and what we see that Israel is using this tourism not only for money, but also in serving its own narrative. There are many CSOs, being Palestinian organizations, Al-Haq or others, and Amnesty. They are focusing on the role of companies such as go for booking.com, where you can book your houses, book houses in settlements. They changed. I have to mix some English with Arabic. They changed their listing from being in Israel into settlements, and this was done after major campaigns. Booking is a Dutch company, So there is an active role for the civil society. So a major part of the efforts were exerted by Palestinian organizations. Also, the human rights law, part of it is new. And so the Palestinian CSOs have been playing an important role that for these organizations that work in Palestine, pushing for the development of part of this law. There is another important role for the Palestinian Authority to have a greater role in combating Israeli policies and Israeli narrative. Like the tour groups, they come to Israel, but they enter West Bank areas. These tours will be on Israeli buses with Israeli guides, be looking at Palestine without knowing that they are in Palestine. So there is an important role for the Palestinian Authority to combat these issues. Also, the Palestinian Authority should focus on the companies, tourists and other companies that work with the Israeli settlement in all areas. Thank you. Just a short comment. The session, we requested the speakers to speak on the economic abuse by the occupation, but the session didn't deal with the Palestinian role, maybe in the future, or other sessions. Unfortunately, our time is over. And we are left with one session. Just to remind you that tomorrow there is a field tour and the registration is across this door. Next session will start after 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you.